What did you say? Not part of a book?
Yavuz? No. Part of the book.
No,
You're asking where it comes from?
no, it's not part of a book.
No, it's not part of the book.
Okay.
Okay, we're on page 45. In the Maimer, the Haven in Rish Chodesh, Hasidic Heritage Series called Feminine Faith, the Maimer of the Rabbi Marash, and we're on page 45. So up until this point, he explained that Hara, even though he said, I don't recognize Hashem, does not mean he doesn't recognize Hashem at all. It meant he recognizes Hashem, that he created the world, created everything in it, and after that, he believes that Hashem abandoned the world and gave over the leadership and the management to the constellations, to the stars, to the angels, whatever it is. And therefore, he only refers to the name Elokim, because the name Elokim implies how Hashem is managing nature. So Hashem is managing nature by giving it over to these forces that they are sort of the ones who manage nature. Havaya is Hashem himself, who's infinite, and he's totally removed from this physical world. And I explained how all this is not true, that even though there are constellations and there are angels and there are so many things in the world that they are operating by natural reasons and natural causes, but all these things are really Hashem himself. But Hashem is just doing it. These are just channels through which Hashem does it. And therefore, Havaya Elokim is one. And that's the main point up until here. V'yadaita hayom, you should know, Ki Hashem hu Elokim, means Hashem who's infinite, and he manages everything in the higher heavens. He's Elokim, he's the same Hashem that's managing and leading and creating every second, everything in this physical world. And as we learned, everything about Hashgacha Pratis, every detail of every single minute detail of all four categories of humans and animals and plants and inanimate, and yet it's all Hashem himself. Good morning. So now we're starting with page 45. The paragraph begins Valzeh. This was the purpose of all the miracles and wonders that Hashem brought onto Paro, the Chol Mitzrayim. It wasn't just a punishment. It was la'amis etzlam, to show them, to prove to them that they should see from their perspective, she'ein kamoini b'chol ha'aretz. These are the words in the pasuk which we learned before. That is no one like Hashem b'chol ha'aretz in the entire earth. That's the specific word. That's the key word here. Not just that Hashem doesn't exist. Hashem exists. That they also knew. But Hashem is the one there's nothing else other than Hashem that manages things b'chol ha'aretz on the earth. There's nothing else. Sharei her lehem, he showed them shein koyach klal l'bchinas mazal Mitzrayim, that the constellations that they sort of provide sustenance and influence to Egypt could not stand in the way against Hashem. Even though you would think, oh, they have the power and they gave Egypt all this power. You see, as soon as Hashem wants otherwise, everything falls apart. Because the constellations don't have any, and that when one iota of their own independence, just like any other tool, like a plowshare that's used to plow a field, or like an axe that's used to chop, and it doesn't have its own independent choices. It's all from the person who's doing it. So too, everything's from Hashem. And therefore, the fact that they were in Egypt and they were slaves was not because the constellations had the power to do that, because Hashem chose for that to be. Hashem, as soon as Hashem chose otherwise, there's nothing they can do to stop it. When they all saw, which means the Egyptians saw, and it became recognized by them from their perspective, by all the great miracles and all the punishments, how they were degraded, that Hashem made and did in them and in their gods. In other words, Hashem didn't only punish them, but part of the 10 plagues was also what Hashem did to their gods. What does that mean? The first plague was which plague? That the water in all the rivers turned into blood. The water in Egypt was really one of the gods, because Egypt was a place there was no rain, and therefore, how does anything grow? So the Nilus, the Nile River, used to rise, and that would bring water to all the fields. So they worshipped the Nile River. They looked at the Nile River as if it was some sort of a god, even though even that bracha came from Yaakov Avinu. You learn in the Chumash that when Yaakov came from Mitzrayim, the bracha he gave to Paro was that they should have the Nile rise and provide water for all the fields. But instead of recognizing Hashem and Yaakov, instead he claimed himself as a god, and they worshiped the Nile River as a god. So when Hashem brought the plague, it's basically showing that the gods have no power to do anything, and Hashem could do with them whatever he wants. Haminu, then they believe, the fisha, at least temporarily, they saw that the constellations, which are the ones belonging to Egypt, they could do nothing to protect themselves from Hashem. Everything that happens is Hashem, it's Hashem's hands. The words in the Chumash, if you remember, when the Egyptians saw the first plague, the second plague, the third plague, finally at a certain point they said to Paro, the magician said, we see here the hands of God, we see here the fingers of God, there's nothing we can do. In other words, they recognize there's no other power that can stand in the way of Hashem. And not only that Hashem exists and he has all that power, but he's managing things down here on earth, not like you thought. And not the way they thought, that Hashem is not involved. Page 47. But Omnam, here's what happened now. Going back to the question at the beginning, how is it possible that the Erev Rav, the group of people that went out of Egypt, were able to convince the Jews that they should worship this calf and say this is the God that took them out of Egypt? How does that make any sense? This calf was just created by them with gold, and it didn't even exist when they went out of Egypt. These people who went out of Egypt, obviously they were inspired, so they thought, let's join the Jews. And then, when things were not going so smooth, they went back to where they were before. When Moshe Rabbeinu was delayed and didn't come down from the mountain, they went back to their old ways, to their old beliefs. In other words, when somebody has a certain belief and it's not really strongly rooted, so when things are just running smoothly, it's fine. But when there's a bump in the road and things get challenging, then the person who has a weak sort of basis, it'll fall apart. There's a famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that says, you have two kinds of trees. You have one tree that has a lot of leaves, but very few roots. And you have another tree that has a lot of roots, but very few leaves. When you look at the two trees, what does it look like? This is a better tree, and this is a worse tree. That's a normal weather. But when there's a very strong wind, there's a hurricane, then the one that has a lot of leaves, but very few roots, is going to be uprooted. The other tree will stand. So the main thing are the roots. How strong is it rooted in? So these people apparently, they did join the Jews. They did recognize this is the emes, so they wanted to be like the Jews, but it wasn't really rooted in. And what happened? As soon as Moshe Rabbeinu didn't show up, there's a crisis. Everything fell apart. There's someone here in Crown Heights that had a very interesting story. that he has a sukkah, and he wanted to make a sukkah a little bit bigger. So he has the neighbor behind him that the trees, the branches of the trees are going into his property, which is not a problem. But if you want to make a sukkah, it can be under tree branches. If she would allow them to cut the branches. So the neighbor wasn't a Jewish person and wasn't a nice person. So they said, no, we don't want you to cut our branches. So he had no choice. He couldn't make the sukkah bigger. But as you know, middle of Sukkot, there was a very strong wind. There was a hurricane, whatever it was, and her tree came down. Next year, he'll be able to make his sukkah. So what makes a tree come down, it's not because it has little leaves or less branches, the roots. So by them, it wasn't rooted in. And therefore, they started to have doubts. And what happens when you have doubts? They fell back to their old beliefs. That is the constellations. And they tried to convince the Yidden the same. What do they say? Mashaloku Amitzrim, they said the fact that the Egyptians were beaten and their constellations couldn't help them. Not only that, but their gods were beaten as well. It's not because Hashem, which is above nature and above the world, was the one who was managing it, and Bashgacha Protis, he made it all happen, but for a different reason. What was the reason that they believed? There are 12 constellations in the sky, and basically every country, every nation is connected to one of those constellations. Mazel Mitzrayim, the constellation which is connected to Egypt and gives life to Egypt, is Mazel Tleh, is Arius, I guess that's what it's called in English, but it means a sheep. In fact, we know that Moshe Rabbeinu told Parei, "Hey nizbach es tevas Mitzrayim le'ineihem." When Moshe Rabbeinu originally said to Parei, "We have to leave," initially he didn't say we're leaving Egypt completely. He said we want to worship our God, we want to bring sacrifices, but we can't do it in Egypt. So let us leave Egypt and do it outside of Egypt. And the implication was, and later we'll come back. Why did he have to leave Egypt? Because the sheep were gods. They worship the sheep. Why do they worship the sheep? Because they get their influence from that constellation, which is the sheep. And therefore, they worship the sheep. And Moshe said, we can't do it here because the Egyptians wouldn't be able to handle it, that we're shechting, we're slaughtering their God. In fact, even today, if you go to Egypt, go to a place like India, people worship animals. I think that's where the expression comes from, holy cow. It's probably, the cows are holy there. It is, they're not allowed to touch them, they're not allowed to bother them because but it doesn't mean they worship the cow. What it really is all about is that this cow represents, and is sort of a manifestation of the source, in this case, of the constellation. And that's what they believe is what's really where the power is coming from. And that constellation sort of channels its energy through these animals down here, which reflect them, which are sheep. Okidua, and as it's known, Shekol Iker Inya Mitzvah's Korban Pesach, that's the deeper reason behind Korban Pesach. When the Jews went out of Egypt, what did they do? They brought a Korban Pesach. And then all the generations in the future, the main mitzvah of Pesach is to eat matzah and to eat a sacrifice which is called Korban Pesach. What is it? It's a sheep. Why? This is the answer. In order to slaughter this sheep, and not only that, it was supposed to do it in a way that it's complete. They weren't allowed to break any bone in the. We're talking about even after the animal was slaughtered, when they were eating it, they weren't allowed to break any bone. It was supposed to be roasted. So when you roast it, it's supposed to be complete. Don't take it apart. Don't cut it up. Complete it as it is. What is the reason for that? Because you have to understand, if this is their God, and then the Jews go and slaughter it, the Egyptians would go crazy. And here Hashem wanted the Jews to show the Egyptians that we defy your beliefs, we don't believe your beliefs, and your beliefs are not really emes. So therefore, he told them to slaughter this which they consider as a god, and to do it in a way that there's no doubts, it's clear. Like if it would be cut up, or it would be cooked instead of roasted, you might say, oh, maybe it's meat from a different animal, maybe it's meat of an ox or something else. But Hashem made sure that it should be done in a way that it's clearly and it's obvious that this is sheep, and we're slaughtering it and we're eating it, which means we're destroying their belief in this God. So the whole union of Pesach was their God was the sheep, meaning the mazel, the constellation. Laharis, this was to show she'ein mamish b'lekei Mitzrayim shu mazal. There is no substance to this constellation of areas because these constellations only operate the way Hashem makes them operate. And we also find something similar with Yosef. Yosef, when he went out of jail, and then he became the second in command in Egypt, his brothers came to visit. You know, the whole story that he didn't know, that they didn't know he was Joseph. And then when finally, before they even came out, he invited them into his house for a meal. It was all part of the process of slowly revealing himself. When he came for the meal, he said that the Jews can't eat together with the Egyptians. Why not? Because we'll be eating something which is their God. So this is clearly what it was all about. So the Erev Rav, they said to the Jews like this, next paragraph. Ki mazel shur, there's another constellation, which is the ox, shur. What is that called in English? Taurus. And that constellation, which is a bull or an ox, was fighting with this constellation. The two constellations, they have two forces, and one is fighting with the other. So what happened, the reason why the Jews were able to go out of Egypt, not because God took them out, because there was another one, and that overpowered the God of Egypt. And it is an interesting thing. I know that there are such stories in the storybooks, but actually there's something in the book of Daniel that describes that the mazalas, the constellations, are having wars with one another. And of course, it doesn't mean chas v'shalom that they have any kind of power. That itself is Hashem is managing that this, just like Hashem makes thunder happening because the two clouds bump into each other, whatever is that's going on, Hashem makes these constellations having some sort of a conflict with each other. But it's not that they themselves are waging any kind of war on their own, and therefore they were saying the reason why Egypt lost the Jewish people was because there was another constellation that overpowered them, but not Hashem. What was that constellation? The ox. So they came to the conclusion that nothing has changed. They believe that the ones who lead the world or manage the world are the constellations. The only question is, which one is stronger? So they told the Yidden, they should make a calf out of gold. But it wasn't worshiping this piece of gold. They were worshiping the constellation of an ox, which was reflected in the ox that they created out of gold. Remember, the question was that how could they believe that this is it? They just created it. How could they say that? The answer is they didn't mean that this is the God. They meant that this is manifesting the God, which is the constellation. Again, based on the belief that the constellations are the ones that are making things happen down here. And that's Avodah Zarah. Get it? Is it clear? Any questions? Now, yes.
Probably not the context of this class, but at some point, I'm just wondering whatever happened to the Erev Rav. Those people, did they turned it, they left the belief, did they?
I think at the end they were still part of the Jewish people, but when there were certain times where it said that all the sins that the Jews committed in the desert, all the stories, usually it was all incited by the Erev Rav.
They stayed.
So I guess at the end they must have been eliminated, and maybe there's no future generations from them. In other words, are there any people today that you can say, oh, this is a descendant of the Erev Rav? I don't know. I got a little research on that. So now we can understand, and this is the main point of the Maimer, where does the difference come in between the men and the women? The men fell for this. They became convinced that it's all about the constellations, and therefore it makes sense to worship this calf. Of course, it says in Rashi that Hashem, part of the test that they went through is because the Satan made a miracle here. Of course, it's all from Hashem. By the way, the same thing is with the Satan. I remember I once gave a class, it wasn't in Crown Heights, somewhere in Manhattan, people that were all new, and I said something about the Satan, and somebody was very upset. And they said, why are you speaking? That's a Christian concept, Satan. Why are you speaking about it? But the truth is, the word Satan is found in Gemara numerous times, in Torah writings numerous times. It's even found in the Torah itself, in one of the books of the Navi, of the prophets. So we believe there's an angel, just like there's an angel of fire, and there's an angel for water, and there's an angel for snow, an angel for this, an angel for that. There's an angel that his function is to mislead people, to try to get them to do Averis. An angel that's here as as the prosecuting angel. And that angel is called the Satan. But we do believe the same thing again. This angel has no power to do anything independently. It's only like Hashem using his right hand or Hashem using his left hand, but it's all Hashem. And therefore it's it didn't come?
No.
It's not here.
That's strange. Okay. Just spoke to him yesterday, confirmed. Okay, you're all welcome.
Sorry for invading.
As long as you don't take us over, Came in the right moment. Okay. So now he's going to explain, so why is it that the women were strong enough not to fail this test, and they continued to believe in Hashem, and the men did get confused, and they started to believe that maybe it's really the way the Egyptians were telling them, that is the constellations that are making things happen. So now we'll start with page 51. Arhine, however, Hanoshim, the women, they did not want this, they did not agree, and therefore, when it came to making the Egon, they asked everybody to give their jewelry, to contribute jewelry to make this golden calf. The women refused to give their jewelry. And in reward for that, they got the Yontif, which is called Rosh Chodesh. And that was the question in the beginning of the Maimer. Number one, why the women were stronger. And number two, why is the reward for not worshiping the golden calf, Rosh Chodesh? What's the connection between the two things? The answer is, this has to do with the source and the root of their souls. So generally speaking, every yid has a soul, men and women, and every soul consists of all the spiritual attributes like it's described in Tanya. There's Chochmah, there's Bina, there's Das, and so on and so forth. However, in the spiritual realm, there is part of the spiritual realm which is masculine, and there's a part of the spiritual realm which is feminine. So we know that there's the 10 spheres are Chochmah, Bina, Das, that's the first three. Then go 7 spheres which are emotion. Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus. So it says in the Zohar that Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, these 6, that's the masculine realm in the spiritual world. Malchus, royalty, that's the feminine realm, which means just like down here there's masculine and feminine, up there there's masculine and feminine. In fact, sometimes you hear people sort of complaining that how come Hashem is always a he, not a she. But it's not true, because there are places in Torah where Hashem, we use a masculine term to describe Hashem, and there are places where we use feminine. Sometimes Hashem is compared to our father, and sometimes it's compared to our mother. and sometimes we use other terms that are feminine, which means that the root of the neshama of a man comes from the 6 emotional attributes. The root of the neshama of a woman comes from malchus. Now again, we all have all 10 attributes, because in the 6 you have all 10 included. In malchus you have all 10 included. But basically, men come from from za, that's what it's called, za, Z-A. Later, when we go through the terms, I'll show you where it is. Comes from the 6 attributes, just like the week. We have 6 days of the week and we have Shabbos. The 6 days of the week, they correspond and they're related to the 6 emotional attributes. Sunday is Chesed, Monday is Gvura, Tuesday is Tiferes, and so on. Friday is the 6th one, Yesod, and Shabbos is Malchus, is royalty. That's why we refer to Shabbos as Queen Shabbos. And by the way, we use the feminine term, because Malchus, royalty, is feminine. Which is a discussion in itself. You have time to read the notes, they go into it more. But that means that spiritually, just like we understand in general that every person has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, so too, in general, men have certain strengths and certain weaknesses, and women have different strengths and different weaknesses. And what is that? What is the reason for that? What does that depend on? Not just something that has to do with the genes. It has to do with the neshama, the soul that comes from Zoh or comes from Malchus. And in many places in Chassidus, in fact, multiple places in Chassidus, they draw a parallel between the function of the spheres up there and function of men and women down here, where we see how men and women down here reflect what go on with the spheres up there. So in context of this discussion, let's see how this makes a difference in terms of what happened with the men and the women. The source of the women's neshama is called the Alma de Nukva. It's called the female world, the feminine world, but it's Malchus. In reference to Malchus, it says Malchusei Bakoil Mashala. His Malchus, his kingdom, his royalty, rules over everything. Which means Bechinas Malchus is Reish Al Kol Ayin Sarin Shalamayla. Even though we know that there are all these constellations, and the constellations get their, the constellations get their energy from the 70 angels. There are 70 angels that they're in charge of all the 70 nations in the world. But they themselves, where do they get their energy from? Of course, from Hashem. But specifically, which attribute of Hashem is the one that channels energy to the 70 angels? It's Malchus. In general, Malchus is the last of the 10 spheres, and Malchus is always that sphere that gives life to the next world. Let's say in Atzilus, there are 10 spheres. So Malchus of Atzilus is the source and gives life to the world of Bria. Then in Bria, there's 10 spheres. Malchus of Bria gives life to the world of Yetzirah. And again, this is similar to the way things are down here. Who are the ones that bring into the world the new generation? These are the women who the children, the babies are born, and they're the ones who deliver the babies, which means they're the ones who bring in the new generation, as if the power to create new life is in the power of a woman. Same thing up there. The spirit of Malchus creates the next world. So this world gets its life force and gets its vitality from Malchus of the higher world. Malchus. And that Malchus is also the source where women come from. The Yadu, and therefore the women knew, the Irgishu, and they felt, they had that sense in them, in their souls, She'ein mamish b'mazolas b'sarim hanal, that there's no real substance to these ministering angels, or there's no real substance to all these constellations. Masher Yadu v'Irgishu Anoshim, they felt it and they sensed it more and stronger than the men. Why? In other words, the women felt the presence of Hashem in this world more than the men felt it. because their source came from a place in the spiritual realm that's more connected to this world. The men's neshama come from a source which is higher, true, but because of that, it's more removed from the physical world. So they didn't sense the presence of that level of godliness in this world. I was thinking to myself to compare it to something, maybe I mentioned it, I think, in the beginning of the year. In 1994, there was this incident that we would never know about if not for the scientists who were watching this happen. And that is that it was actually in the summer of 1994. And the reason why it's so significant is because there was something in the Zohar that actually predicted that this is going to happen, that Jupiter was being hit by meteorites for a whole week. And you can look this up online, so you'll see the details. But it says that the amount of what was happening would be equivalent to, imagine planet Earth being hit, listen to this number, by 300 million atom bombs. Now, if planet Earth would God to be hit by 300 million atom bombs, you could imagine the noise it would make, and you can imagine the fireworks you would see. Unbelievable. But guess what? People were walking around, no one heard anything, no one saw anything. When there's thunder, everybody hears it. Some people even get frightened. How can it be? Thunder, which is so much less, frightens you. And that, which is 300 million atom bombs, doesn't have any impact whatsoever. What's the difference? Because that's happening somewhere very far away. So even though it's happening, and even though it's this huge explosion, we don't even have enough words to describe it, but it's distant from me. I don't feel it. I don't sense it. But the thunder, which is much less than that, is relatively, it's a small little bit of noise, but it's closer to me. So I hear it and I feel it. It has an impact on me. In a certain sense, this is the same thing, that the neshama of a man, the source of his neshama, is from a place that's distant from this physical world. So it's much more challenging that we should feel Hashem's presence, which is our source in this physical world, because it's so removed. The source of a woman's neshama is from Malchus, and therefore a woman naturally and inherently feels and senses Hashem's presence, because the source of her neshama, which is Hashem's presence, is more connected to the physical world here. In fact, this is the reason, according to Chassidus, for a lot of the laws that pertain to differences between men and women. Like, why don't women have to put on tefillin? And why don't women have to wear a talis? And why don't women wear tzitzis? And why don't women do other mitzvahs? So if we understand that the mitzvahs are there to heighten our awareness of Hashem, so women also need that. And there's all sorts of answers that are given, but the answer that's given in Chassidus and Kabbalah is that women naturally have a sense of and feel and conscious of Hashem's presence, and they don't need these physical acts to heighten their awareness. They have it in them naturally. And men do need something additional to heighten their awareness. This is the reason, because the source in the spiritual realm that we're connected to is further away. So we need more action and more things to heighten our awareness. The source of a woman's neshama is closer, and therefore naturally she could feel the presence of Hashem. So,
because women came from Malchut and men came from
Zoh. Zoh is the 6 midas besides Malchus. Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. Sometimes it's
like first and after the Zoh.
No, there's 7. Chesed is the first of the 7, and Malchus is the last of the 7th. Think of the 6 days of the week. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. Shabbos is Malchus.
So Malchut, it's more important. Kind of.
The women, yeah, it's more.
No, Shabbos, because Shabbos.
Just like Shabbos here,
Yeah.
the holiest day of the week. And Shabbos is the day that sort of provides us with the bracha and the strength for the rest of the week. Same idea, that Malchus is the source for the whatever's coming next. I remember we did have a class in the beginning, in the first month, I mentioned what it says in the Zohar, that all the days of the week get blessed from Shabbos. And it means two things. Number one, all the brachas we have, especially in Parnasa, even though Shabbos we're not working, but dafka on that day, that's when Hashem establishes the blessing for each person for the rest of the week. In a spiritual sense, what it means is that Shabbos is a day of rest. It's a day that we don't have to be so involved in the Gashmizik world. So we have more of an opportunity and more time to invest ourselves in our spiritual connection. And whatever we accomplish in that sense on Shabbos, that enables us to keep our spiritual balance for the rest of the week. So the Zohar says this in reference to the story in Chumash, that the Yidden in the Midbar, where did they have their sustenance from? It was a miracle. Food came down from Shemayim. So the Zohar says, even though the food came down every day of the week, except for one day, Shabbos. But what day in the week did Hashem give the bracha for all the month that's going to fall the rest of the week? That was on Shabbos. So Shabbos is the day that all the days of the week get blessed from Shabbos. And therefore, therefore Malchus is considered the source of blessing. Let's turn the page 52, 53. Here you see inside that the neshamas of men is me'alma de duchra, which is from the masculine realm, which is called ze'er ampin, which I said before are the 6 midas, which is, and ze'er ampin is exalted, it's further away from these worlds. Asher al kain omrim hamakrishem hashgacha pratis. That's why those who deny hashgacha pratis, that Hashem is really managing every single detail in this world all by himself, not, God forbid, through some other agent or through, it's everything Hashem himself directly. They say these words, ala shamayim kavod, that Hashem's glory is on the heavens. In other words, that's Zod Atzilus. They say that Hashem is high and he's exalted and he's infinite and he's removed from this world. Azav es and Pchinas Malchus is not connected, as if to say, as Malchus is sort of independent, and Malchus is the one that connects to this world. In fact, this explains another thing, why the nations in the world, they count their year, their calendar goes by the sun, and our calendar goes by the moon. Generally speaking, the sun is considered higher than the moon. Why is that? Because basically the sun is really a source of light, and the moon really only reflects the light of the sun. So the sun is the one that's sort of giving off light, and the moon is the Why did Hashem make it? Nations of the world, they go by the sun, which seems to be higher, and we go by the moon, which seems to be lower. Ki achama, ki nesenes. That, in fact, is the reason that they say Hashemayim kavod, Hashem's glory, Hashem's presence is huge, it's infinite, it's amazing, but it's up there, removed from us, and that's why they're connected to the sun, which is representing a level of godliness that's higher. And unfortunately, what's the conclusion? He's so high that he's not connected to the physical world. And what happens here in the physical world is not being dictated by Hashem, is not being run by Hashem, but by other forces. But Yidden, we go by the moon, and that means we recognize Hashem. The moon is the sphere of Malchus, which is closer to us, and therefore we sense and we feel Hashem's presence, how he's more connected to earth. And so on one hand, you would say Malchus is the lower sphere, but on the other hand, specifically because of that, we're more in tune to it and we feel it, and therefore our emunah in Hashem is more complete, that we feel Hashem's presence, how it's involved in the physical world and everything going on in the physical world. So generally speaking, this is the difference between the nations of the world and Yidden. This is the difference between the sun and the moon, and this is the difference between men and women. It's all about the sphere of Zah or Malchus. We have one more page to conclude. The conclusion is going to be, after we understand all this, we'll understand how the women, because they were strong, what gift did they get that they should celebrate Rosh Chodesh, which is celebrating the moon, because that's actually their source, which is Malchus, and that's what gives them the strength to be able. That's where they got that strength to be able to overcome this test that they had with not believing what the Egyptians believed. Okay, we'll stop here, and I guess Monday we'll probably finish the mimer and we'll start reviewing the Mitzvah Hashem. Anything happened at the dome last night that the crowd is sort of got lost? What? Sick.
What?
I woke up and like 4 people were like getting, what's that? Some medicine out of the thing.
Really?
Really?
Yeah.
We see.
I mean, I gave it clear some people Harlem yesterday, but doesn't mean they have to get sick. Okay. Okay, everybody should have a full shleima. You know that in the dome, by the way, if somebody gets sick, you really have to take precautions that it doesn't spread because everybody's using the same sink and bathrooms and food.
You're already
They have to use.
Let's hope Monday everyone come and not stay home.
I hope that
Madam.
I hope that everybody gets well today.
Yeah.
It's a good shot.
We're not Jewish before, and then they converted, and we left, and they were the ones who told the man to do. And then the Satan, so the question, how did the Satan make the ox emerge? Like the Satan was the one that like inspired that. Yeah.
Shab to Elayach, Shab.
Ciao.
Where's the point of the sugar Esel? I חושב שהוא לא מזמן.
אז אפשר.
זה 10.
בעצם?
סליחה, חשבתי שזה יהיה